The company said the bridge shelter was condemned. The drifter had already fixed it. Tobias Kerr had $18, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd bought used from a retiring bridge inspector 2 towns back, and a habit of walking underneath any bridge he crossed, rather than simply over it. A habit that had gotten him a fair number of odd looks over the past year, but had also, more than once, led him to exactly the kind of shelter that kept him out of the weather. He was 22 years old, laid off from a state bridge inspection crew 8 months earlier, when budget cuts eliminated his entire seasonal position, and he had been moving through the river towns of the county ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The layoff had come with a form letter thanking him for his service and citing budget realignment, language Tobias had read enough times since to understand it meant, in practice, that a state government which had employed both him and his father for a combined 40 years had decided, in a single fiscal quarter, that neither of their jobs were worth protecting when a cheaper alternative existed. His father had taken early retirement rather than fight for a diminished position. Tobias had taken to the road instead, unwilling yet to accept that the only work he'd ever wanted to do no longer had room for him in it. He found the old truss bridge outside Millrace Ford on a cold afternoon, its steel spans crossing a narrow river gorge on the east edge of town, and beneath the near abutment, built into the stone foundation the way bridge maintenance chambers so often were on structures. This old, a low concrete room with a rusted steel door standing slightly ajar. A faded placard bolted beside the door read, "Millrace Ford River Bridge, Maintenance Access," and a newer sign zip-tied over it read, "Structure Condemned, Demolition Pending, Ridgeline Infrastructure Group." Tobias stood at the door a long while before he went in. He had grown up the son of a county bridge inspector, riding along on inspection runs from the age of 10, learning the specific vocabulary of steel under stress, the difference between surface rust and section loss, between a bearing pad that had simply aged and one that had actually failed, a distinction that had never once left him even after the state cut the funding that once employed both him and his father. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and found, inside, a maintenance chamber that had clearly once served bridge crews properly. A workbench along one wall, a small wood stove vented through the concrete, and shelves holding tools gone to rust from years of damp river air, rather than any real neglect of purpose. The river's low, steady sound came through the concrete walls even here, a constant presence that Tobias found, somewhat to his own surprise, more comforting than unsettling after a year of sleeping in places that offered no sound at all beyond his own uneasy breathing. He did not have anywhere else he needed to be that night. He set his bag down on the driest section of floor and decided, the way he'd decided about every structure exactly like this one over the past year, that he would at least understand what was actually wrong with it before he judged the company's condemnation notice to be either right or wrong. He walked into Millrace Ford itself the next morning looking for day work, and found, within his first hour in town, that the bridge already carried more weight in local conversation than its condemned sign suggested it should. "That bridge has been the only real crossing for the east side of this county for 60 years, said a broad-shouldered man behind the counter of the feed store, his name patch reading Dale. "State's building a new bypass bridge 4 miles downstream, but it's a full season behind schedule, and Ridgeline's already condemned the old crossing anyway, on account of their contract bonus depends on hitting the original demolition date regardless of whether the new bridge is actually ready to replace it. So the east side loses its bridge before the new one's finished," Tobias said. "East side loses its bridge and gains a 40-minute detour on gravel roads that wash out every spring," Dale said. "School bus route, ambulance response time, farm trucks hauling grain to the co-op. All of it's about to get considerably longer, over a bonus clause in somebody's contract." He studied Tobias a moment. "Why the interest?" "No reason," Tobias said. which was, as it seemed to be for every drifter answering that question in every town exactly like this one, a lie. Dale Whitcomb, as Tobias learned over the following days, farmed 300 acres on the east side himself, and had spent the better part of a year attending county meetings trying, without much success, to get anyone with real authority to question Ridgeline's condemnation notice before the bypass bridge was actually finished. Dale started stopping by the bridge most evenings after his own farm work was done. At first, simply to watch Tobias's progress with the particular skepticism of a man who'd been disappointed by promises before, and later, as the weeks passed, to bring tools from his own barn that Tobias needed and couldn't otherwise afford, or an extra plate of dinner his wife had packed without being asked to. "Wasn't using half of this anyway," Dale would say, setting down a coil of wire or a box of stainless bolts, in the same tone Tobias had already learned meant considerably more than the words themselves let on. "You've got a nephew who rides that bus route," Tobias said one evening, watching Dale unload a toolbox from his truck. "I've got a nephew who rides that bus route, and a wife whose mother needs the county hospital more often than either of us likes to think about, and 80 acres on the wrong side of a river that's about to get considerably harder to cross," Dale said. "I'm not helping you out of charity, son. I'm helping you because this bridge staying up is the difference between my family having options and not having them." County engineers signed off on the condemnation without a fresh inspection, Dale said on Tobias's third visit to the feed store. "Just accepted Ridgeline's own report, which happens to recommend demolishing the bridge their contract already commits them to demolishing. I've asked twice for an independent inspection, told both times there's no budget for it, and the schedule doesn't allow the delay regardless." The mockery, when it came mostly from two younger men who worked seasonal construction for a competing contractor and drank their coffee at the feed store's counter most mornings, one of whom made a point of asking, loud enough for Tobias to hear across the room, whether the drifter squatting under a condemned bridge understood what happened to trespassers who got caught inside an active demolition site. Tobias said nothing to that, because he had learned over a year on the road that defending yourself to men who had already decided what you were rarely changed anything except your own dignity. A woman at the diner across the street was gentler in manner but no more encouraging, telling him over his first cup of coffee that a young man ought to think carefully before making a home of a structure the state itself had already condemned, whatever his personal opinion of its condition might be. Tobias didn't argue that either. He had learned, in a year of exactly this kind of conversation in exactly this kind of town, that most people weren't actually asking him to justify himself. They were asking permission to stop wondering about the stranger in their midst, and a quiet answer usually granted that faster than any real explanation could. Tobias spent his first full week at the bridge doing the only thing he knew how to do with the little he had. He looked at what was actually wrong with the structure, rather than what Ridgeline's report claimed was wrong with it. The bearing pads at the near abutment, where the steel span rested on the concrete foundation, had degraded significantly, the rubber gone brittle and cracked from decades of weather, exactly the kind of maintenance item that could genuinely compromise a bridge's safety if left unaddressed. Tobias spent 4 days replacing the 2 worst pads with salvaged rubber stock he found, still usable, in the maintenance chamber's own supply shelves, jacking the span's load off each bearing point a fraction at a time with a hydraulic jack he'd bought used with his first week's feed store wages, working with the same patient caution his father had drilled into him since childhood. Never rush a load-bearing repair, and never trust a single jack to hold what it hadn't been tested to hold. The gusset plates at 2 of the truss's lower connections showed surface corrosion that looked considerably worse than it actually was, once Tobias wire-brushed the scale away and inspected the steel beneath, finding section loss within acceptable tolerance rather than the structural compromise Ridgeline's report had described. He cleaned and repainted each connection with a rust-inhibiting compound he found, sealed and clearly unused, in the maintenance chamber's supply locker, restoring a protective coating that had clearly been neglected for years, but had never actually let the underlying steel fail. The drainage system beneath the deck, meant to keep runoff from pooling against the steel and accelerating corrosion, had clogged entirely with decades of debris, and Tobias spent 2 full days clearing every scupper and drain line by hand, restoring a flow path that Ridgeline's report had apparently never considered worth checking before condemning the whole structure over its downstream effects. The abutment's expansion joints, meant to let the steel span shift slightly with temperature changes without binding against the concrete, had filled solid with compacted grit and gravel over the years, a condition that could, left unaddressed long enough, eventually crack the very concrete Ridgeline's report cited as evidence of structural distress. Tobias spent the better part of a day clearing each joint out with a hand chisel and wire brush, repacking them with proper joint filler he found sealed in the maintenance chamber's supply shelves, restoring the span's ability to move exactly as its original designers had intended, rather than fighting against a foundation that had, over the years, quietly begun taking on stresses it was never meant to bear. It was in the maintenance chamber's supply cabinet, behind a stack of old inspection forms, that Tobias found the logbook, its cover reading F. Boyd, Bridge Inspector, Millrace Ford District, 1968-1996. He read it that same evening by lantern light, and understood, well before he reached the final entries, exactly why Dale Whitcomb had never trusted a company report that happened to align perfectly with that same company's financial incentive. Franklin Boyd had inspected this bridge personally for 28 years, and his logbook read like the record of a careful man who had never once let a season pass without documenting the structure's true condition in exhaustive, specific detail. The entries from his final decade of service described exactly the bearing pad, degradation, and gusset plate corrosion Tobias had already found and corrected, alongside Boyd's own professional assessment, dated a full 4 years before his retirement. Recommend bearing pad replacement and gusset connection, recoating within the next maintenance cycle. Structure remains sound for its rated load with these items addressed. This is routine maintenance, not structural failure, and should not be characterized as the latter to any future funding authority. There was a later entry, closer to Boyd's retirement, that Tobias read a second time before setting the logbook aside for the night. District Office asked me today to characterize the bridge's condition for a state funding request. I told them plainly what I've told them every year. Routine maintenance items, structure sound, no urgency beyond ordinary upkeep. They seemed disappointed by the answer. I've come to understand that an honest inspection report is sometimes less useful to the people asking for it than a dramatic one would be, which is exactly why I've never once agreed to write anything but the honest version. Tobias closed the logbook and sat with it a long while, understanding that he was holding in his own 2 hands 30 years of honest inspection data that directly contradicted whatever report Ridgeline Infrastructure Group had used to justify condemning a structure Franklin Boyd had never once called anything worse than in need of routine care. By the time Tobias had cleared the last of the expansion joints and stood back to survey 3 weeks of steady work, the bridge no longer looked, to his own trained eye at least, like anything a responsible inspector could honestly call condemned. He had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to think of the maintenance chamber less as a place he was merely passing through, and more as the first workspace in a year of drifting that had actually felt like his to keep in order. The company man arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Tobias had arrived, stepping out of a truck lettered Ridgeline Infrastructure Group with a hard hat under one arm and a tablet in the other hand. "Name's Grant Foley," the man said. "Regional project manager for the demolition contract on this structure. I understand you've been staying in the maintenance chamber." "I have," Tobias said. "I've also replaced the degraded bearing pads and recoated the corroded gusset connections. This bridge isn't structurally condemned, Mr. Foley." It needed routine maintenance that nobody had performed in years, and I've performed it." Foley's expression carried the particular patience of a man who had given this same speech in other towns before. "The demolition schedule's tied to our bypass bridge completion contract," he said. "Whatever maintenance you perform doesn't change the fact that this structure's condemnation was approved by the county based on our engineering assessment. I've got a demolition crew scheduled for 3 weeks from now, bypass bridge finished or not. I'd suggest you clear out before then. Your own engineering assessment matches, almost word for word, the exact maintenance items Franklin Boyd flagged as routine 4 years before he retired." Tobias said, "I have his logbook, 30 years of honest inspection data that never once called this bridge anything worse than in need of upkeep. Your report calls the same items structural failure. I'd like to understand why." Foley's composure held, but something behind his eyes tightened. "I don't write the reports," he said. "I execute the contracts based on them. If you have a dispute with the engineering findings, that's a matter for the county, not for a man squatting in a condemned maintenance chamber." "Then I'll take it to the county," Tobias said. "That's your right," Foley said, "though I'd remind you the county's the same body that already approved our condemnation once. I don't expect a squatter's testimony to carry more weight than a licensed engineering assessment, whatever a retired inspector wrote down in his personal notebook 30 years ago. Franklin Boyd inspected this exact bridge for 28 years, Tobias said. That's not a personal notebook, Mr. Foley. That's the most complete maintenance record this structure has, and it happens to directly contradict the report your bonus depends on. Something behind Foley's composed expression tightened for the first time. I'd be careful making accusations about bonus incentives you don't have documentation for, he said. I don't need documentation for that, Tobias said. I just need the county to compare Boyd's inspection history against your report side by side and let them draw their own conclusions about why the two documents disagree so specifically about the exact same components. Foley looked at him a long moment, then got back in his truck without another word and drove off down the gravel access road faster than the grade really allowed. Word reached Dale Whitcomb by that same evening, and he drove out to the bridge himself, standing at the maintenance chamber door with an expression Tobias hadn't seen on him before. Ridgeline's bonus clause pays out an extra $200,000 if the old bridge comes down on the original schedule, bypass finished or not, Dale said. I found that out from a county clerk who probably shouldn't have told me. That's not an engineering decision, Tobias. That's a financial one wearing an engineering report as a disguise. Then we need to get Franklin Boyd's logbook in front of somebody at the county who isn't already committed to Ridgeline's version of events, Tobias said. County board meets in 10 days, Dale said. I'll see to it we're both on the agenda. Word spread through the east side quickly after that, the way it always did in farm country where neighbors depended on each other's news more than any official channel. A handful of East Side families drove out to the bridge over the following days, some to look at Tobias's repairs with their own eyes, others simply to stand at the abutment and remember, out loud, every close call the old bridge had gotten them through over the decades. A difficult birth once, delivered safely at the county hospital, only because the crossing had held in a storm nobody expected. A fire truck, years before that, reaching a bomb blaze 20 minutes faster than the detour route, would have allowed. By the time the county meeting arrived, Tobias understood that Franklin Boyd's logbook was no longer the only evidence in the room. It was simply the written version of what half the East Side already knew from memory. The county board meeting drew a larger crowd than Tobias expected, most of Millrace Ford's east side turning out once word spread that the bridge's condemnation might actually be reversible. Grant Foley presented Ridgeline's engineering assessment, with the polished confidence of a man delivering a presentation he'd given many times before, emphasizing the contract's demolition timeline and the liability of leaving a structurally compromised bridge standing any longer than necessary. It was Dale who stood when the floor opened for public comment. "I've farmed the east side of this county for 30 years, he said. "I've asked twice for an independent inspection of this bridge and been told twice there's no budget for it. There's a reason for that. Ridgeline's own inspector, a man named Franklin Boyd, kept a personal logbook for 28 years documenting this bridge's actual condition. He never once called it anything worse than routine maintenance. I have that logbook here, and I'd like this board to compare it against the report you approved." A woman near the back of the room, introduced afterward as the district's school transportation supervisor, spoke next without waiting to be formally recognized. "I route 2 school buses across that bridge every morning," she said. "If it comes down before the bypass is finished, both routes add nearly 40 minutes each way on gravel roads that flood every spring. I'd like this board to weigh that against a bonus clause before approving anything further." A council member near the end of the table read the marked passages for a long moment before passing the logbook down the row. "This inspector's final assessment is dated 4 years before the company's current report," she said slowly. "Both describe the same bearing pads and gusset connections. One calls it routine maintenance. The other calls it structural failure requiring demolition. I'd like to understand that discrepancy before we approve any further action on this contract." Foley's composure held through the question, but Tobias noticed for the first time real strain beneath it. "Engineering assessments can differ based on updated load standards," he said. "I'm not in a position to relitigate our own inspector's methodology in this meeting." "Then perhaps this board should commission an independent inspection before approving further demolition funds," the council member said, "given that we now have direct documentation contradicting the basis for the original condemnation." The board voted that same evening to suspend the demolition schedule pending an independent structural review, a decision that put Ridgeline's contract bonus and the original timeline it depended on into open question for the first time since the condemnation notice had gone up. The flood came 11 days later, faster than the regional forecast had predicted, the river rising nearly 6 feet overnight after 2 days of steady mountain rain that showed no sign of easing. Tobias had spent that morning checking the bearing pads one final time on his own initiative, some instinct telling him the swollen water below the span deserved the same careful attention he'd given every other part of the bridge, and it was standing at the near abutment, watching brown floodwater churn past only a few feet below the lowest steel member, that he first understood how badly the unfinished bypass crossing downstream was likely faring against the same current. The flood swelled the river high enough that the unfinished bypass bridge's temporary construction access road washed out entirely, cutting the east side's only alternate route at the exact moment a farm accident on Dale Whitcomb's own property left his teenage nephew in urgent need of the hospital on the county seat side of the river. It was Dale himself who reached Tobias first, driving too fast down the gravel road to the old bridge, shouting before he'd even brought the truck to a full stop. "The bypass access road's underwater. This bridge is the only way across, and I need to know right now whether what you fixed is going to hold a loaded ambulance." "The bearing pads are rated for full highway load," Tobias said, already moving toward the span to do a final visual check under the pressure of the moment, rather than any real doubt about the work itself. "The gusset connections are sound. I tested every repair myself before I ever brought it to the county's attention." The ambulance arrived from the county seat side 12 minutes later, its lights cutting through the rain and gray afternoon light, and Tobias stood at the near abutment with his heart working harder than the moment should have required from a man who'd already tested every inch of this repair with his own hands. He watched it slow at the far approach, the driver clearly uncertain about a bridge still wearing a condemned placard despite whatever assurance the county dispatcher had passed along, and understood that the next 30 seconds would settle, more plainly than any council meeting ever could, whether his 3 weeks of work had actually been enough. The ambulance came on across, feeling every wheel's weight pass over the bearing pads Tobias had replaced by hand, the structure holding steady and true, exactly the way Franklin Boyd's 30 years of honest inspection had always said it would if properly maintained. Partway across, the ambulance's rear wheels caught a section of decking that had buckled slightly under the sudden weight after weeks of standing water pressure against the abutment below, the vehicle lurching hard enough that Tobias's chest went cold watching it. But the bearing pads held their load without further shift, the driver correcting smoothly, and the ambulance cleared the far end of the span at speed, carrying Dale's nephew toward the hospital without further incident. Dale stood beside Tobias at the abutment, both of them soaked through, watching the ambulance's taillights disappear down the county seat road. "That's my sister's only boy," Dale said quietly, his voice unsteady in a way Tobias hadn't heard from him before. If this bridge had come down on schedule like Ridgeline wanted, that detour road would have cost him 25 extra minutes he might not have had. He didn't say anything else for a long while, and neither did Tobias, both of them simply standing in the rain watching the taillights fade, understanding, without needing to say so aloud, exactly what those 3 weeks of work had actually been worth. Grant Foley arrived at the bridge himself within the hour, having heard, the way everyone eventually heard everything in a county this size, that the structure his company had condemned had just carried an emergency vehicle across floodwaters that had taken out his own project's access road entirely. "That bridge just did what our bypass road couldn't," Foley said, staring at the span, rain still falling around them. "How is a condemned structure carrying ambulance loads across floodwater right now?" "Because it was never actually condemned," Tobias said. "It was inconvenient to your contract's bonus schedule. Franklin Boyd's logbook said so 4 years before your report claimed otherwise, and tonight said so again, considerably more directly than any inspection ever could." Foley didn't answer that. He simply stood in the rain looking at the bridge for a long while, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. And Tobias understood, watching him, that whatever came next for Ridgeline's contract, the bonus clause tied to the original demolition schedule had very likely just become impossible for anyone in that company to defend with a straight face. The county's independent structural review, completed within the month, confirmed exactly what Franklin Boyd's logbook and Tobias's own repairs had already demonstrated. The bridge was structurally sound, its previous condemnation based on an assessment the review characterized diplomatically as significantly more conservative than warranted by observed conditions. Ridgeline's demolition contract was terminated, its bonus clause voided, and the county instead funded a proper maintenance program for the old bridge to run alongside the eventually completed bypass, giving the east side 2 crossings instead of the one they'd nearly lost entirely. Grant Foley left the county before the bypass bridge was finished, reassigned, Tobias heard secondhand, to a different project in a different state entirely. He stopped by the maintenance chamber once before he left, an unannounced visit that surprised Tobias more than anything Foley had said in their previous conversations. "I've spent 9 years executing contracts I didn't write and reports I didn't question," Foley said, standing in the chamber's doorway with none of the polish he'd carried on his first visit. "This is the first one where the contradiction got put in front of me plainly enough that I couldn't look past it anymore. I don't know what that's worth to you. I wanted to say it before I left regardless." He didn't apologize outright, but Tobias understood, watching him go, that something in the man had shifted permanently, whether or not it changed how he did his job going forward. Tobias stayed on as the bridge's maintenance caretaker, a position the county created once it understood the structure would remain in service indefinitely, and he kept Franklin Boyd's logbook on the same shelf where he'd found it, alongside a second logbook of his own. On its first page, he wrote the only sentence that felt honest enough to begin with. This bridge was called condemned by people whose contract paid better, if it was. Franklin Boyd spent 28 years writing down the truth anyway. I intend to keep doing the same for as long as this crossing needs someone watching it. Dale Whitcomb's nephew recovered fully from the accident that had sent him across the bridge that night, and came by the maintenance chamber himself once he was back on his feet, standing a little awkwardly in the doorway before thanking Tobias directly for a repair job the boy admitted he hadn't thought much about until it very nearly hadn't been there for him. Dale himself stopped by the maintenance chamber most weeks after that, not always with news, sometimes only to sit by the wood stove a while and talk about nothing in particular, the way two people do once a shared crisis has settled into something closer to friendship than circumstance. The two younger men who'd once mocked Tobias at the feed store counter never did apologize outright, but one of them, Tobias noticed some months later, had taken a job on the crew that finally finished the bypass bridge properly, working with considerably more care than Ridgeline's original contract had ever seemed to require of anyone. Tobias's father, when Tobias finally wrote to him about the whole affair, wrote back a single line that Tobias kept folded inside Franklin Boyd's logbook from then on. "Your grandfather used to say a bridge doesn't lie about its condition. People do. Sounds like you found a man who never once let that happen on his watch, and decided to be the same kind yourself. I'm proud of you, son, in case nobody in that county has thought to say so yet." Tobias wrote back, describing the maintenance chamber in more detail than he suspected his father actually needed. The wood stove, the shelf where both logbooks now sat side by side, the particular quality of morning light through the small window that overlooked the span itself. He did not describe it, he realized only after sealing the envelope, the way a man describes a temporary stop on a longer journey. He described it the way a man describes the place he has already decided. Without quite announcing it to himself first, he intends to stay. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many honest reports get quietly overruled by more convenient ones, simply because the convenient version happens to pay somebody's bonus on schedule? And what does it take, a flood, a drifter, a dead man's logbook, for the truth to finally cross the river before somebody else has to? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Savage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.